Two quotes built one of the darkest reputations in human history. It is better to be feared than loved. The ends justify the means. For centuries, both have been pinned to one man. Students repeat them. Politicians whisper them. Social media turns them into proof that power is evil. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Only one of those lines actually came from Niccolò Machiavelli. The other was invented later, then repeated so often the world accepted it as fact. And that mistake shaped history, because Machiavelli didn't just become controversial. He became a symbol. His name stopped being a person and turned into a warning. Call someone Machiavellian today and you're not calling them strategic. You're calling them cold, manipulative, dangerous. But reputations built on fear usually hide something deeper. Machiavelli wasn't born plotting tyranny. He wasn't raised inside palaces. He wasn't teaching cruelty to kings. He was watching governments collapse in real time, watching heroes become traitors overnight, watching leaders destroyed not because they were evil, but because they were unprepared. And that observation planted a dangerous idea in his mind. Maybe the world doesn't fall because of villains. Maybe it falls because good men don't understand power. To understand why he wrote what he wrote, you first need to understand the world that created him. Because Machiavelli wasn't shaped by philosophy. He was shaped by chaos. Then his own world collapsed. A new regime seized Florence. Loyal officials were purged. Machiavelli was arrested, accused of conspiracy, and thrown into prison. He was interrogated, tortured, and eventually exiled from the political life he had dedicated himself to. One day he was negotiating with kings. The next, he was a forgotten man in the countryside. No army, no influence, no position, just silence. Most men would have disappeared into bitterness. Machiavelli did something else. Every evening, after working on his small farm, he would change into formal court clothes before sitting down to write. Not because anyone would see him, not because it restored his status, because in his mind he was still speaking to rulers, still trying to warn them, still trying to explain the patterns he had witnessed. He wasn't writing to justify cruelty. He was writing to explain why leaders fail, why states collapse, and why moral intentions alone cannot hold power together. He believed the greatest danger to a nation wasn't an evil ruler. It was an unprepared one. And so, in exile, stripped of authority, he began writing the work that would make his name feared for centuries. A small political handbook, direct, cold, practical, a book that didn't describe the world as people wished it worked, but as he had watched it operate. Florence looked beautiful from the outside. Art, wealth, culture, influence, the kind of city history remembers as glorious. But inside its walls, stability didn't exist. Governments changed like seasons. Alliances shattered without warning. Leaders who ruled one year could be imprisoned the next. Public praise meant nothing because crowds turned faster than armies moved. Young Machiavelli grew up watching this instability like other children watched the weather. He saw respected officials dragged from power. He saw celebrated commanders blamed for losses they couldn't control. He saw politicians loved by the people one week and hunted the next. And slowly, a brutal realization formed. Virtue alone could not protect a leader. Being liked did not mean being safe. Moral speeches did not stop betrayal. Power wasn't about being good. It was about surviving long enough to do any good at all. When Machiavelli finally entered government service, he wasn't stepping into theory. He stepped into a battlefield disguised as politics. He negotiated with foreign rulers, studied military commanders, and observed how authority actually functioned when real stakes were involved. And what he saw disturbed him. The leaders who survived weren't always the most ethical. But the leaders who fell were almost always the most naive. That pattern would haunt him, because once you see that survival follows rules, you can't unsee it. And eventually, those observations would push him to write something dangerous. Not a story, not a philosophy, a manual. When the manuscript circulated, it didn't sound like anything Europe expected. No heroic speeches, no idealistic sermons, no comforting illusions about noble rulers and loyal citizens. Instead, It spoke about fear, instability, betrayal, perception, and control. It treated politics like a survival environment instead of a moral classroom. It described leadership as something fragile, constantly threatened, constantly contested. That book was The Prince, and it scared people immediately, not because it encouraged evil, because it exposed reality. Religious authorities condemned it, moral philosophers attacked it, leaders publicly rejected it while privately studying it. The public didn't read it carefully, but they heard enough rumors to know it sounded dangerous. And slowly a myth formed. Machiavelli wasn't seen as a realist. He was branded the teacher of tyranny, the man who believed cruelty was good, the mind behind ruthless leadership. But here's what almost nobody noticed. He never said cruelty was desirable. He said instability was deadly. And if stability required hard choices, pretending those choices didn't exist would destroy nations faster than facing them. The world didn't want that message. So it simplified him into a villain. Because villains are easier to dismiss than uncomfortable truths. Over the next 500 years, Machiavelli's name stopped belonging to the man who wrote the book. It became shorthand for manipulation. Plays used him as a symbol of evil advisors. Political enemies used his name as an accusation. Schools taught simplified summaries instead of the actual arguments. Quotes were invented and attached to him because they sounded like something a Machiavellian villain would say. The myth grew louder than the reality, and the deeper irony was almost invisible. Many of the leaders who condemned Machiavelli publicly ruled exactly the way his analysis predicted they would. They understood something most readers didn't. He wasn't teaching rulers to become monsters. He was warning them what monsters already existed in the political world. Ignore those realities, and your state collapses. Understand them, and you might survive long enough to protect your people. Machiavelli wasn't writing about how power should feel. He was writing about how power behaves when everything is at risk. And that distinction is the difference between propaganda and survival. But there's one problem. Almost nobody actually reads the book itself. They read the reputation. And that's where the real story begins. Because here's the truth most videos will never tell you. The most famous lines from Machiavelli don't even make sense unless you read the chapters around them. The statements people call ruthless are often surrounded by warnings, conditions, and strategic limits that completely change their meaning. Taken alone, they sound brutal. Read properly, they sound like battlefield instructions for leaders trapped in unstable worlds. And once you see the full context, something unsettling happens. You stop asking whether Machiavelli was evil. You start asking whether modern leaders secretly follow the same rules, just without admitting it. So in the next episode, we're not talking about the myth anymore. We're opening the book itself, page by page, strategy by strategy, because the first chapter of The Prince contains a lesson about power that most people misunderstand. And once you hear it, you'll start noticing the same pattern in politics, corporations, social groups, and even friendships. And once you see that pattern, you can't unsee it. Episode 2 begins with the first rule Machiavelli believed every new ruler must understand. And it's far more dangerous than better to be feared than loved.